My name is Ron Dorn, and this is a presentation about GCU 113 about landmark policies. In particular, it's focusing on United States of America's environmental policies that are not only landmark in the USA, but they impact the world. The presentation objectives are that prior to the Republican administration of Richard Nixon, environmental disasters were devastating people's health. And they were not uncommon, and they were setting up lifelong health issues. Bipartisan policies established under a Republican president established the EPA and led to legal protection for air and water, and that the balance between regulation and pollution is an ongoing policy debate. Prior to the Nixon administration, environmental disasters were impacting rivers, the air, the biological systems. A photo comparison of the Hudson River prior to Nixon and after the cleanup. There were rivers that were catching on fire. They were so polluted. There were massive oil spills right around cities like Detroit. And Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring that pesticides were killing off birds and basically working their way up the food chain with incredible environmental devastation. And there was the psychological impact of looking back at Earth from the moon, that we were just an island, and that if we pollute our island, we're all in trouble. DDT was pushed as a tremendous benefit for people around the world, getting rid of insects and pests, but it was associated with increased frequency of cancer. Prior to the Nixon administration, people were spraying it unprotected right out into the environment, to rivers, to farms. And what happens is the DDT in the water is bioaccumulated. It works its way and it's concentrated in zooplankton, then in fish, then into birds, and also through agricultural systems into people. There were also PCBs that were suspected to cause birth defects and be a major carcinogen that were widely used and found in environments like rivers, ponds, and agricultural systems. There was dioxin contaminated on beaches, and immediately people were losing their hair, developing sores. Horses died. They became emaciated. Children were in the area that were exposed to dioxin, developed horrible health conditions. So there was a new environmentalism as opposed to the older one of Thoreau. There was a new environmentalism in the 1960s that as people became aware of environmental issues affecting air, water, radiation, pesticide poisoning, they demanded the federal government take more responsibility for protecting people. And public concern for the environment became clear during the Earth Day demonstrations of 1970. So before the Nixon administration, you'd have such horrible issues like smog in LA that people would attend events and wear gas masks. That if you look at the peak ozone in LA, it peaked in the 1950s and 1960s before regulation on cars and other industries were put in place. What I'm trying to say is that before the Nixon administration, there was such a horrific environmental disaster around every corner that the Environmental Protection Agency and other issues, other organizations were empowered to establish environmental policies. So Nixon signed NEPA, which is the major environmental legislation that set up the EPA, and it was amended in 1969 and signed into law by Nixon in 1970. So Congress and Nixon, bipartisan, recognized the need to create a policy to protect the environment for the present generations and for the future, our future. The law applies only to federal agencies and requires that prior to taking any major or significant action, the agency consider the environmental impact of that action. So the idea is before you do anything at the federal level, before you approve anything, before you have legislation, before one of the federal agencies takes action, there has to be an environmental impact statement. So the EPA represents a merger of environmental issues in the Department of Agriculture, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Interior, into one agency. And then came the Clean Air Act of 1970. And the EPA immediately implemented lead-based paint restrictions to protect children. And EPA then defined air pollution dangerous levels to prevent the smog disasters. And then it banned DDT. And then there was the Clean Water Act in 1972 and the Oceans Dumping Act. So the EPA established through NEPA in a bipartisan way was not the start of clean water and clean air. The Clean Water Act was initiated a long time ago through the River Harbor Act and through 1948's Federal Water Pollution Control Act. But the burning of rivers became a catalyst for true change. So following the Clean Water Act and amendments in 1972, and then again in 1977, and then again in 1987, the idea is that protecting our water became, yes, regulated, but continued to grow as environmental issues became aware through research. For example, lead gasoline was phased out. There was no reason to have lead in gas. It was just there, put in for reasons that were long since relevant. So it was phased out. Then there was a Toxic Substances Control Act that was signed by Gerald Ford, again, a Republican president. There was the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then pesticides that are known to cause cancer were banned. So then you had, after Nixon, you had Jimmy Carter. And then Carter was followed by Reagan. And Reagan was really not a friendly environmental president. But the first Bush that follows considered himself an environmental president who was definitely a Republican. So the EPA's authority exists to act quickly. In other words, if there was new research indicating that there was a problem, the EPA could, through various mechanisms, ban something that was killing kids, making kids sick, making adults sick. So there are a whole bunch of statutes that follow the development of the EPA that you can see here that continually regulated environmental issues to prevent disasters. There are a lot of statutes because as technology develops, there are a lot of issues that develop. So in the past, bipartisan protection somehow now has become part of culture wars, that the present day House Republicans are trying to pass measures to rein in the EPA, to promote domestic energy. So now we're getting more of a debate on regulation versus deregulation. Do you have protection or do you let business potentially do things that can impact the environment. So there are a lot of complicated issues. And at the present time, another aspect of the ongoing culture wars is that environmental protection rivals the economy in some areas of the public, not all. And there's a great divide at the present time in the culture wars that's growing between Democrats and Republicans. And this used to not be the case. It used to be a bipartisan environmental issue where the balance between regulation and environmental protection was established. And it's possible that the visceral reaction against the word climate change amongst certain areas of the political spectrum has pushed the issue of environmental protection into the other end of the spectrum, desiring deregulation. Because there's no question that climate change and environmental issues go hand in hand, that climate is affected by the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and that our consumption of fossil fuel is leading to land use changes, deforestation, and especially impacting such areas as the Arctic Ocean. Oceans are acidifying. As you increase carbon dioxide, you increase the ability for the oceans to become more acidic, and that endangers coral reefs. It leads to warmer ocean temperatures. And there's also an ongoing issue of oil pollution. How do you protect pollution from impacting the ocean and the land when you deregulate the drilling of oil? So, in conclusion, we've come a very long way. That in the earliest part of the United States, before becoming a country, and then in the first 200 years, discharges of all forms of pollution were horrific and destroying the environment. There were practices that destroyed local health and national level health. So the Dust Bowl in the 1930s could potentially be an example of environmental degradation. You overcrop the soil and you make the land susceptible to wind erosion. There used to be toxic wastes floating down rivers. And there were notorious pollution incidents like the LA killer smog events. Sorry about that. The Love Canal in the 1970s was a horrific issue, destroying people's health. In Pennsylvania, there was a horrific air pollution incident of leading to deaths. So we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the toxic control substitutes enacted by bipartisan action, but the battle between money and health is seemingly endless. So in conclusion, we live in an interesting time where this battle is ongoing, and it's really a question of where that balance rests is a political decision, but you have your say.